Assessment centers are another type of work sample test or situational judgment test, but it focuses on management skills. And typically people are off-site and they go through a role play. It's a very elaborate role play. And the content validity of these tests is incredibly good, but it's incredibly expensive. But what they do is they take them through a set of essential skills that an individual needs to be able to demonstrate management potential. Now, this isn't the only thing that we want to use to determine whether or not someone will be a good leader, but it's a good sense of what they're good at and what they know, and how they might apply it in a real life situation. So it's not enough to just ask a behavioral question or a situational question. We actually put them in the situation. So it goes beyond the structured interview and it really gets into, here's a scenario, work it out. How do you solve this problem? How do you set priorities? How are you going to handle these competing demands, and what are you going to do about it? And they have a long history of being very valid, but also they are expensive for sure. Biodata is also a very important selection tool, and biodata gives us a sense of their work-related education, any kind of training and certifications they have. It isn't just a resume. It's more elaborate than a resume. And it isn't an incredibly valid tool, so if you're going to use it, you need to make sure you supplement with high validity tests in order to make sure you've got a selection system that's balanced, that has some high validity tests, high fidelity tests, and then some that are maybe a little bit more variable. You don't make your final decision based on a tool that has low validity, but there's good information there that if you have, all things being equal, this one is better at this skill than the other, and I want that skill, then I might hire that individual. So it is a very important thing to have, to make sure that we are getting a good sense of all the biographical data related to what this person can bring to the table for the organization. Biodata can give us a good sense of what someone might be like in the future. So if we look at some of their work and non-work experience, we look at some of their past behaviors and their activities, that can give us some insight, not entirely, but some insight. Problem is that we can use it and perhaps unintentionally use it as a way to discriminate against people who may do things that we don't understand, but it doesn't mean that they're not valid experiences. So we just need to be really mindful of adverse impact and discrimination if we're using biodata, because people are being very vulnerable in what they're sharing with us, and that could leave us open to charges of discrimination if we're not clear. Resumes are another tool. It's similar to biodata, but remember, the biodata is what you are asking for, whereas the resume is what the applicant wants you to know. So it's two different perspectives. And the resume is used primarily as a screening tool. So there isn't going to be a uniform format, but it can result in some unconscious or conscious bias or discrimination, and we want to be really careful about rushing to judgment. And again, one of the most important things to do is to recognize that names can bias people, whether it is an ethnic name versus a more Western style name, or whether it's a male versus a female name. We know that there is an unconscious bias attached to anybody that doesn't have a Western name or is a male. And it doesn't mean they think they are unqualified. They just assume they are less qualified than a white male, when in fact that's not always the case. So if you are going to submit a resume for a job and you're going to apply, these are some recommendations for you, and in a way that you can get over any of the AI matches that might be inappropriate. For example, if the job ad includes certain terms or language, model those terms and language in your resume so that it's going to see it, it's going to flag it, and it's going to move the resume on to the next step. You want to make sure also that your resume, you don't have just one resume. You have multiple variations of your resume, and you're going to make subtle changes to it depending on what the job ad says it wants. If the job ad says it wants a particular skill and it's not explicit in your resume, then you want to make sure that you make it explicit. So look at the job ad and then tailor your resume based on what it is that you're reading in that job ad. And then, contrary to popular belief, a cover letter can make a difference because it is your opportunity to reflect on things, to share things, and to communicate information that isn't necessarily going to be communicated in your resume. So crafting a respectful, professional cover letter is an important skill, and you should always work with an employment agency or some sort of HR professional to help you to do that. References and background checks are also really important. We always want to do a background check where the job involves vulnerable populations like the elderly or children, or if it's a high security job where people are working with money, along with doing an integrity test. You also want to make sure you're doing background checks. Criminal background checks are not as popular. They're still important though, particularly if certain crimes would make you ineligible to do these jobs. For example, someone who's a child molester, you don't want them driving a school bus of children or working in a school district, right? That doesn't mean that they can't work elsewhere, and they should be allowed to work elsewhere, but they are not allowed to work around children. So the criminal background check will pick up that information. Letters of reference are also incredibly important because those letters of reference, if you remember I said earlier, right, when you get additional information about a job candidate that goes above and beyond just what you see on the resume, that gives you a richer sense of the applicant. And as I told you from my own research study, we found that additional information that was given to the applicant, that was given to the hiring manager, the decision maker, that additional information made a big difference in the way women candidates were perceived. And so we always want to make sure we don't limit access to reference checks and background information about people. We want to check in. We want more information. The richer the information, the better it is for us. Physical ability tests are very similar to work sample tests in that physical ability tests um, for physically demanding jobs are very important. For example, if you want to be a police officer or a firefighter, you want to be able to demonstrate that you can do the tasks. And so it is a rigorous training program in order to get in, and you have to pass the tests in order to be a firefighter or a police officer. And so they will take you through a whole range of activities that one would normally expect a firefighter or a police officer to do. And then if you demonstrate it, that increases your ability to get that job. So we only really want to use physical ability tests for physically demanding jobs, where the job is so physical that they have to be able to demonstrate that they can do it. And sometimes it's about strength, sometimes it's about eye-hand coordination, or what we call a psychomotor test, being able to make a decision quickly. So if you can imagine a police officer walking into a scenario where they don't know who is the criminal and who is the victim or the witness, and they need to make a quick decision about how to handle the scenario. And so that's an important skill. Social media is really controversial, and there are many states that have outlawed using social media to make hiring decisions. Um, so we obviously want to separate the applicant and what we know about that applicant from their application blanks and what they post on their social media. And again, some people are like, well, if they're doing something that embarrasses the company, well, possibly, but you would have to be able to witness it. What you see on social media is not always an accurate representation of what happens. Um, you might see a whole bunch of drunk people in a photo doing something and then turn around and recognize that one of the individuals in the photo wasn't drunk, but they were there with their friends who were. So should they be found guilty of being drunk and misbehaving when in fact they weren't drunk at all? They were the only sober one in the group. They were the designated driver. We don't know what is going on in social media. Again, we know it's not realistic. It is a representation of how people want to be perceived. And we want to be mindful of not using it to make hiring decisions. So, again, know what the law is in your state. Know that you cannot use it for screening. And so be mindful of that. Obviously, diversity and inclusion are important issues to organizations despite the pushback. And we want to make sure we cast a wide net to increase the likelihood of hiring people who may have disabilities, who may have neurodiversity, because they all bring something unique to the table, and we want to be able to find ways to hire and bring in diverse ideas to our companies. Lastly, credit history can be a concern because if someone has poor credit, it could be that way for a whole host of reasons. And some people have poor credit because they had a house that never sold and they had to foreclose on the house because financial difficulties. Maybe they got sick and they couldn't pay their mortgage anymore. There's a whole host of reasons why someone might have a poor credit history. Credit history can really only matter when you're in a job where if you have extraordinary debt, you increase the likelihood you're going to steal from the company or may be more likely to embezzle from the company. But ultimately, credit history is not a good predictor of someone's ability to do a job, and we shouldn't be using it in that scenario. There's a lot of research that's been done on applicant reactions to the selection process. And in fact, my dissertation was on this this very important topic. And what we argue is when we treat people poorly, the applicant reaction to the process can impact their perceptions of the organization and whether or not it's a reasonable place that I want to work. And you might argue, well, if they're going to think that way about me, then I wouldn't want to hire them. But understand, word of mouth happens. So I'm going to tell two friends and they're going to tell two friends. And suddenly your ability to recruit people because you don't treat them fairly or kindly in the hiring process can be hampered. Your ability to hire is going to be hampered. So we want people to know what to expect. We want to be transparent. We want to give them all the information that we can, that we know when screenings are going to happen, when tests are going to happen, when they're going to find out about the results, et cetera, et cetera. We want to make sure people are treated fairly, that they get appropriate feedback, that they are treated with respect, and are given fair, honest communication and transparent communication. And we want to make sure as part of this process is that we're using job-related selection methods. If we're not, again, my reaction to the process is, why would I want to work for this company? And I've had that scenario myself where I've worked for a company and they had me do these really weird selection tests that didn't make any sense to me. And they asked me questions that didn't make any sense. And my reaction was, no, I don't want to work there. Like, if I don't understand what you're doing and why would I want to reach out and be a part of that company? Once we have worked through all of our assessment data, and again, we've developed and decided on selection tools based on the job description and the job specifications that tell us what the tasks are that people need to do, what skills they need to have or KSAs they need to have to be able to do it. And now I've gathered all the data from all those sources, and now I have to make a decision. So how do I do it? Well, sometimes you make a decision based on one criteria, and often for very simple and basic jobs, do you have a degree? Did you go to school? Can you read and write? That's enough. I don't need to know more, right? Simple jobs that aren't very complex don't need a complex selection system, so a simple decision tool is fine. More complex jobs will need different styles of decision making. A multiple hurdle approach is used when we have jobs that are where the danger of a wrong hire is very high. So we want to make sure people can pass every hurdle, right? So high risk jobs where, if someone makes a mistake, there's a lot at stake, then we want to make sure we use a multiple hurdle approach. They have to pass each hurdle and each assessment hurdle in order to be eligible to be hired for the job. Now, as it says here, with multiple hurdles, we want to use the less expensive procedures first because we're going to be using a less expensive procedure with a whole bunch of different people. And we want to be able to screen everybody that comes through the door that are minimally qualified. And so using those less expensive tools first helps us to start to screen out the poorer candidates. And then you leave your most expensive test for the very end, because that's going to be the one that's going to really differentiate between the finalists to help you make that final decision. Another way that we can make selection decisions is what we call a compensatory model. And the compensatory model basically argues that I can be low in some areas and high in others. And a compensatory model works well when we know what we're going to do is train people once they get the job. And if we can train them once they get the job, that will make a big difference for us, and then we should be able to hire and move forward from there. So we're okay if someone might be low in a particular area if we know we're going to train them on it later. Or they're really strong here and maybe not as strong here, but the area in which they're really strong matters more to me than the area where they're a little weak. So it's, as we call it, a compensatory model, and it's a weighted model. Like this is weighted 10%, that's weighted 50%, and then how they score on those things is the way that I start to discern, how I'm going to make those decisions.